Thomas Whitmore's laughter echoed across the mansion's veranda like the crack of a whip. 5 languages, he scoffed, looking down at the 12-year-old boy standing before him in bare feet and patched clothes. Boy, you can barely speak proper English. Samuel, son of Martha, a woman who had been freed only 27 years earlier, stood motionless. Beside him, his mother clutched a basket of freshly laundered clothes, her hands still wrinkled from the cold river water. She knew she had made a terrible mistake allowing her son to speak in Mr. Whitmore's presence. Thomas Whitmore, a 52-year-old cotton farmer and owner of 2,000 acres of Mississippi land, hadn't been this entertained since the old days before the war. This black boy, son of his washerwoman, had just claimed to speak 5 languages when Thomas had said he doubted the child could even read a full page. Samuel apologized to Mr. Whitmore, Martha whispered, her voice laden with years of submission and fear. Fear of losing the job that fed her son. Fear of the violence that men like Whitmore still exercised freely even after abolition. No need for apologies, Thomas said, smiling cruelly. I want to hear more of this fantasy. Tell me, boy, what are these 5 languages you claim to speak? Samuel took a deep breath. At 12 years old, he had already learned that the world judged people like him and his mother before even knowing them. Son of a former slave, black, living in a one-room cabin. All the marks that men like Thomas used to justify their contempt. English, French, Latin, ancient Greek, and German, Samuel replied calmly. Each word pronounced with a clarity that made Thomas stop laughing for a moment. Liar, Thomas declared, spitting tobacco. Martha, your boy has serious problems with reality. Maybe you should whip him instead of letting him make up stories. Martha lowered her head, feeling the weight of familiar humiliation. For 7 years since emancipation, she had washed clothes for this family, endured degrading comments and miserable wages. She needed that job. But seeing her son, her brilliant, determined Samuel, being ridiculed this way was a pain that cut deeper than any personal insult. Mother, Samuel said softly, touching her arm. It's all right. Thomas observed the interaction with a cruel smile. He loved these moments of absolute power when he could remind people of their place in the social hierarchy. Even with abolition, he had found ways to keep blacks subjugated, starvation wages, Jim Crow laws, and the ever-present terror of the Ku Klux Klan. You know what I think, Martha? Thomas leaned back in his rocking chair. I think your boy is jealous of my sons who study at the private academy. So he invents these fantasies to feel special. Sir, Samuel interrupted, his voice still calm, but carrying a dignity that surprised Thomas. Do you read Latin? Thomas frowned. Of course I do. I studied at the finest college in South Carolina. Then you would understand if I said veritas vos liberabit, sed primo vos iatum fat. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stared at Samuel, processing the words in perfect classical Latin he had just heard. This wasn't basic Sunday school Latin. It was a complex structure with advanced grammar and impeccable pronunciation from the Roman tradition. Martha looked back and forth between her son and Thomas, sensing that something had changed in the air, but not understanding what Samuel had said. Where did you learn that? Thomas asked, genuinely confused for the first time in years. Samuel smiled for the first time since arriving at that veranda. At the Methodist Church, sir. Reverend Howard offers free classes every afternoon for anyone who wants to learn. Thomas felt something strange stir in his chest, a mixture of surprise and something that could be no impossible. Respect. This was just a memorized phrase. Anyone can memorize a phrase, Thomas said, trying to regain control. That doesn't mean you speak the language. You're right, sir, Samuel agreed. That's why I brought this. Samuel opened his worn cloth bag and pulled out a document that made Thomas choke. It was an official certificate of proficiency in Latin and Greek issued by Lorne University, the first university for blacks in Mississippi, attesting that Samuel had completed studies equivalent to secondary level in both classical languages. This is fake, Thomas stammered, but his voice no longer had the same conviction. Samuel pulled out another piece of paper. This is my certificate from the French program at the Episcopal Church. And this is from the German course that Professor Muller, the immigrant who lives in town, offers on Saturdays. Thomas took the documents with trembling hands. They were all authentic, all signed by recognized institutions and people. This 12-year-old boy, son of his washerwoman, had achieved a level of education that rivaled graduates from the finest schools in the South. How was all Thomas could whisper? What Thomas didn't know was that Samuel had a secret much bigger than simply speaking 5 languages. And that secret was about to destroy everything Thomas thought he knew about intelligence, race, and the true meaning of freedom. What Thomas didn't realize was that Samuel hadn't appeared on that verb by chance. For months he had been planning this moment, gathering information and preparing a demonstration that would not only change Thomas's perception of him, but reveal a truth about the farmer himself that could change the fate of hundreds of people. Thomas examined the certificates for several minutes, desperately searching for some evidence of forgery. But the more he looked, the more his arrogance transformed into something close to panic. The signatures were authentic, the seals official, the dates consistent. "This still doesn't prove anything," Thomas muttered more to himself than to Samuel. "You could have stolen these certificates, or someone made them for you." "You're right, sir," Samuel agreed with a calm that made Thomas even more uncomfortable. "That's why I brought Reverend Howard." Samuel waved, and a white man in a cassock emerged from the road. Reverend Jonathan Howard, a figure respected even among the white farmers of the county. "Mr. Whitmore," said Reverend Howard, "Samuel Johnson is the most brilliant student I've had in 30 years of teaching. He masters Latin and Greek better than any seminarian I've ever known." Thomas felt the ground move beneath his feet. "Reverend, you're teaching a Negro. I'm teaching a genius," the Reverend corrected firmly. "And if you doubted his ability, I would be happy to test his knowledge right here." For the next hour on the ver of the Whitmore mansion, Samuel demonstrated his fluency in 5 languages. He translated passages from the Bible from Latin to English, recited Homer in ancient Greek, conversed in French with Thomas's wife, who had studied in New Orleans, and read excerpts from Goethe in German. Each demonstration was like a blow to Thomas's pride. His own sons, with all their privileges and expensive education, couldn't accomplish half of what that barefoot black boy was doing. When Samuel finished, Thomas was pale, gripping the arms of his chair. "How?" was all he could ask. "I have 4 free hours per day," Samuel explained simply. "From 5 to 7 in the morning when I help my mother, and from 8 o'clock at night until midnight when everyone sleeps. I've used that time for the past 5 years to study." "5 years," Thomas whispered. "You were 7 years old when you started. 7 years and 3 months, Samuel corrected. "That's when Reverend Howard taught me to read. After that, I realized that knowledge was the only thing no one could take from me. Not Jim Crow laws, not the Klan, not men like you, sir." The statement hung in the air like an accusation. "Samuel," Martha said, alarmed, but Reverend Howard placed a hand on her shoulder, reassuring her. "Mr. Whitmore," Samuel said, his voice still calm but now loaded with purpose. "I didn't come here today to impress you with my knowledge of languages." "You didn't," Thomas managed to say. "No, I came because I overheard your conversation with Mr. Patterson last week about the land deed north of your property." Thomas palled even more. "How did you— Were you spying?" "I was washing the windows," Samuel corrected. "And it happens that you made a critical error in interpreting the Latin legal deed, an error that means you're not the legitimate owner of those 300 acres. The silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "You're lying," Thomas whispered, but there was panic in his voice. Samuel pulled out another document from his bag. "This is a copy of the original deed which I found in the county's public records. It's in legal Latin like all the old deeds in this region. You interpreted term adjacent as adjacent land. Don't, but in Roman legal context it means contiguous but not connected land. The 300 acres are not part of your property." Thomas grabbed the document, his eyes racing over the Latin words. He had paid $5,000 for that land 5 years ago based on his interpretation of the ancient deed. This can't be right," Thomas stammered. "But it is," said Reverend Howard softly. "I asked 2 Latin professors from Malorne University to confirm. Samuel is correct. According to the law, those 300 acres still belong to the original heirs." Thomas looked at Samuel with a mixture of shock and something new. Fear. "Why are you telling me this? You could use this information to destroy me." "I could," Samuel agreed, "but that's not what I want." "What do you want?" Thomas whispered. Samuel took a deep breath. "I want you to make a choice. You can try to ignore this information and I'll take it to the true owners of the land who will likely sue you and ruin you." Thomas closed his eyes, or Samuel continued. "You can acknowledge your mistake, return the land to the legitimate heirs and learn an important lesson, that intelligence and worth have no skin color." "And what do I gain from this?" Thomas asked bitterly. Besides losing 300 acres and looking like a fool, you gained the chance to do something no farmer in this county has ever done, Samuel replied. You can open a school in the old house on your property, the one that's abandoned, a school where children like me can learn during the day, not just in the few hours we managed to steal from exhaustion. Thomas looked at Samuel as if seeing him for the first time. You planned all of this for 5 years, Samuel confirmed. Since the day I learned to read and realized that knowledge was power, true power, not the power to humiliate or oppress, but the power to change the world. Martha had tears streaming down her face. Samuel, you're asking too much. No, Mother, Samuel said gently. I'm asking exactly what is fair. Thomas was silent for a long time, looking at the cotton fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, fields that had been cultivated by enslaved people, including Martha's parents, fields that were still cultivated by technically free people, but trapped by poverty and lack of education. If I do this, Thomas said slowly, I'll be ridiculed. The other farmers will call me a traitor to the white race. The clan might even burn my property. Or, said Reverend Howard, you'll be remembered as the man who had the courage to do what was right, as the man who recognized that true greatness lies in elevating others, not trampling them. Thomas looked at Samuel. Do you really believe that education can change everything? I am the proof, Samuel replied simply. 5 years ago, I was just the illiterate son of a washerwoman. Today I know more Latin than the county lawyers. Imagine what hundreds of children like me could achieve with real education. Thomas closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was something different in them. Not complete acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. I need time to think, he said finally. You have until noon tomorrow, Samuel said calmly. After that, I'll take the information about the deed to the legitimate heirs. They have a right to know. Samuel and Martha turned to leave. Reverend Howard followed them, but stopped on the bare steps. Mr. Whitmore, he said, that boy just gave you something precious. Not the knowledge about the deed, but the opportunity for redemption. I hope you're wise enough to accept it. The night was long for Thomas Whitmore. He sat in his study, surrounded by ledgers and legal documents, a bottle of bourbon beside him growing emptier by the hour. The Latin deed lay on his desk, mocking him with every glance. His wife, Ella Lanena, had retired hours ago, confused by his distracted state at dinner. His sons were asleep in their rooms, dreaming whatever dreams privileged young men dream. And Thomas sat alone with a truth he couldn't escape. A 12-year-old black boy had outsmarted him. It wasn't just the land. Thomas could afford to lose 300 acres, though it would sting. What truly shook him was the casual destruction of everything he believed about the natural order of the world. He had been taught since childhood that whites were inherently superior, that blacks were designed by God to serve, that the hierarchy of race was as immutable as the rising sun. But Samuel Johnson had demonstrated something Thomas couldn't rationalize away. That boy's mind was sharper, more disciplined, more powerful than Thomas's own, and he had achieved it with nothing. No tutors, no private schools, no libraries of his own, just stolen hours and iron determination. Thomas poured another bourbon. The Latin phrase Samuel had spoken echoed in his mind. Veritas vos liberabit sed primo vosatum fat. The truth will set you free, but first it will make you angry. How appropriate. Thomas was angry at Samuel for exposing him, at himself for the error, at the world for changing in ways he didn't understand. But beneath the anger was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like respect. A knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called. His eldest son, Robert, age 16, entered hesitantly. Father, I saw your light still burning. Is everything all right? Thomas looked at his son, tall, well-fed, educated at the county's best academy, a young man who had every advantage in life. Robert, how's your Latin coming along? Robert shifted uncomfortably. Well enough, I suppose. Professor Hendris says I'm adequate. Adequate? Thomas repeated. Could you translate a legal document for me in classical Latin? I know, Father, that's quite advanced. Perhaps after university. A 12-year-old boy did it today, Thomas interrupted. A black boy, the son of our washerwoman. He translated it perfectly. He speaks 5 languages fluently. Robert stared at his father. That's impossible. That's what I thought, Thomas said, until he proved it. Not just claimed it, not just showed certificates, but demonstrated it in front of me, your mother, and Reverend Howard. The boy is brilliant, Robert. More brilliant than you, more brilliant than me, more brilliant than anyone I've ever met. Robert's face reened. Father, surely you don't believe. I saw it with my own eyes. Thomas slammed his hand on the desk. And that's what terrifies me, son. Because if that boy can achieve such heights with nothing but determination and borrowed hours, what does that say about us? About our advantages, our education, our claims of superiority? Robert was silent, struggling with ideas that contradicted everything he'd been taught. He's asked me to open a school, Thomas continued quietly, for black children on our property in exchange for information that could ruin me financially. You can't, Robert said immediately. The other planters would turn on us. The Klan? Yes, the Klan, Thomas interrupted. We speak of them casually, don't we? As if terror is just another tool of social order. When did we become men who hide behind masked cowards in the night? Father, you're not yourself. This boy has clearly manipulated. He showed me the truth. Thomas stood abruptly. That's not manipulation, that's education. That's exactly what we've been trying to deny people like him. Because we know, Robert, deep down, we've always known. If we give them the same opportunities, they'll prove we were never superior at all. We were just born luckier. Robert stared at his father as if at a stranger. What are you going to do? Thomas looked out the window toward the old overseer's house, abandoned since the war. It was sturdy, large enough for 30 students. It would need work, but it could be done. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I have until noon tomorrow to decide what kind of man I want to be. Morning came too quickly. Thomas had barely slept, dozing fitfully in his chair. He washed, dressed, and went downstairs to find Elena waiting for him with coffee and a worried expression. Thomas, what's troubling you? You've been strange since yesterday. He told her everything about Samuel, the languages, the deed, the ultimatum. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to shock to something Thomas couldn't quite read. A school for Negro children, she said finally. On our land, yes. And if you refuse, we lose 300 acres and face lawsuits. Yes. Elelina was quiet for a long moment. Then do you remember why we came to Mississippi, Thomas? The question surprised him. For the land? The opportunity? No, Elelina corrected gently. We came because you said you wanted to build something meaningful. You were tired of Charleston society, of playing games with old money families. You wanted to create something real. Thomas had forgotten. The idealistic young man he'd been at 25 seemed like a stranger now. This is your chance, Eleanor continued, not to just own land, but to actually build something that matters, to be remembered for something other than cotton yields and profit margins. You would support this, even with the social consequences? Elena smiled sadly. Thomas, I've watched you become harder each year, more cynical, more cruel. This place has changed you. Maybe this boy is offering you a chance to find the man I married. The clock struck 11:30. Thomas stood, putting on his hat. I need to go where? To make a choice. Samuel was waiting at the old overseer's house along with Martha and Reverend Howard. Thomas rode up alone, having left his horse and buggy at the main house. Mr. Whitmore, Samuel said formally, have you made your decision? Thomas looked at the building, weathered, but solid with good bones. He thought about his sons, given every advantage, yet achieving modest results. He thought about Samuel, given nothing yet, achieving the extraordinary. He thought about the kind of world he was helping to create and whether it was one he could be proud of. I have conditions, Thomas said. Samuel's expression didn't change. What conditions? First, this school will be open not just to black children, but to any child whose family can't afford the academy fees, poor whites included. Reverend Howard nodded approvingly. A wise decision. It prevents you from being seen as favoring one race. Second, you will attend and help teach. Your knowledge is too valuable to waste. I plan to, Samuel said. Third, I want transparency, regular reports on the students' progress. I need to prove to the community that education works regardless of race or class. Agreed, Samuel said. Thomas took a breath. And fourth, I want you to teach me. That surprised everyone, even Reverend Howard. Teach you what, sir? Samuel asked carefully. To be better, Thomas said quietly. I've realized that my education taught me facts and languages, but it didn't teach me wisdom. It didn't teach me to see people as they are. A 12-year-old boy had to teach me that. and I suspect there's more I need to learn." Samuel studied Thomas for a long moment, then he extended his hand. "I accept your conditions, Mr. Whitmore." Thomas shook the boy's hand, feeling the callous palm of someone who had worked hard for everything he had. "There's something you should know," Samuel said, not releasing the handshake. "The truth about the deed." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What truth? You were right the first time. Terram ad Ascentem does mean adjacent land in that legal context. The 300 acres are legally yours." Thomas stared at him, comprehension dawning slowly. You lied. I presented a plausible interpretation that you couldn't verify without significant research." Samuel corrected. "I gambled that your guilt over the larger issues would prevent you from investigating thoroughly." "You manipulated me," Thomas said. "But there was no heat in it, only wonder." "I gave you a choice," Samuel replied. "You could have called my bluff, hired lawyers, verified the information, but you didn't. You chose to do the right thing because you believed it was right, not because you were forced to." Reverend Howard was chuckling. Martha looked torn between pride and horror at her son's audacity. "That's why you're truly brilliant," Thomas said slowly. "Not just the languages, the strategy, the psychology. You understood that I needed a reason to justify changing, a way to maintain my pride while doing the right thing. People rarely change from lectures, sir." Samuel said they change when they find their own reasons to. I just provided the catalyst. Thomas shook his head in amazement. "You're 12 years old." 12 years and 4 months, Samuel corrected with a slight smile. "And I've been planning this for 5 years. As I mentioned, I knew I would need leverage to create change. So I became invaluable first, then presented options. What if I had chosen to expose you instead to have you punished for the deception? Then I would have learned an important lesson about the limits of reason in confronting power," Samuel said. "But I didn't think you would, because beneath your prejudices, Mr. Whitmore, you strike me as a man who wants to believe the world can be better than it is." Thomas was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed, a genuine laugh, free of bitterness. "I've been outwitted by a child, completely and thoroughly outwitted. Does that change your decision?" Samuel asked carefully. "No," Thomas said strangely. "It reinforces it. You've proven exactly what this school could accomplish. If one boy with stolen hours can become this capable, imagine what dozens could do with proper instruction." He turned to Reverend Howard. "I'll need your help organizing this, finding teachers, setting curriculum." "You'll have it," the Reverend promised. "And Martha," Thomas said, turning to the woman who had stood silently throughout, "I'll be needing someone to manage the school's practical affairs. The position pays better than laundry work." Martha's eyes widened. "Sir, I don't know if I can. Your son just orchestrated a social revolution before he's old enough to shave." Thomas interrupted. "I think you can handle school administration." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." "Thank you." The school opened 3 months later. Thomas had to endure threats, social ostracism, and one terrifying night when Klan riders circled his property. But he also received unexpected support from several ministers, from progressive business owners in Jackson, and even from a few plantation owners who privately admitted they admired his courage. The first class had 23 students, 17 black, 6 white, ages ranging from 7 to 15. Samuel served as assistant teacher, helping Reverend Howard with languages and mathematics. Thomas attended the opening day, making a brief speech about opportunity and merit. He watched Samuel help a struggling student with Latin pronunciation, patient and encouraging. He watched Martha organizing supplies with quiet efficiency, and he watched the children, all the children, regardless of color, learning together. That evening, Thomas wrote a letter to his brother in Charleston. "I have done something that would have been unthinkable to me a year ago. I have helped establish a school for the poorest children of our county without regard to race. I was manipulated into this decision by a 12-year-old boy who speaks 5 languages and thinks 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But here is the extraordinary thing. I don't regret it. These children, black and white, poor and forgotten, they are brilliant. Given even basic resources, they excel. It shames me to realize how much potential we've wasted in maintaining our supposed superiority. Samuel Johnson, the boy who started all this, has become something like a teacher to me. Not in languages, though he could teach me much there, but in seeing people as they are, rather than as I was taught to see them." I don't know if this school will survive. The opposition is fierce, and there are dark forces that would burn it down if they could. But for now, it exists, and every day it exists is proof that the old order is dying, whether we like it or not. You would call me a radical, I suppose, a traitor to our class and race. But I feel more myself than I have in decades. Perhaps that's what truth does. It strips away the comfortable lies and forces you to confront who you really are. 5 years later, the school had grown to 75 students and 3 teachers. Samuel, now 17, was preparing to attend a Lorne University on a full scholarship. He would go on to become a translator for the State Department, speaking not 5 but 9 languages fluently, and would play a quiet but significant role in diplomatic negotiations for decades. Martha managed the school for 23 years, becoming one of the most respected educational administrators in Mississippi. She never remarried, dedicating her life to ensuring other children had the opportunities her son had fought to create. Thomas Whitmore lived to see the school expand twice, educating over 1,000 students before his death in 1915. His obituary in the Jackson Clarion Ledger mentioned his cotton production and land holdings, but the final paragraph noted, "Perhaps Mr. Whitmore's greatest legacy was his unlikely partnership with Samuel Johnson in establishing the Whitmore School, which has educated some of the finest minds in Mississippi, regardless of race or economic station." On his deathbed, Thomas asked to see Samuel, who came immediately from Washington, where he was translating for a trade delegation. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked, his voice weak. "The manipulation, the lie about the deed." Samuel smiled. "Do you regret being manipulated?" "No," Thomas admitted. "It was the making of me. But I'm curious. When did you decide I was worth the gamble?" Samuel thought carefully. "When you admitted you didn't know something, when you asked me how I learned Latin instead of simply dismissing me. In that moment, I saw a man who valued truth over pride. That's rare, especially in someone with power." "I was a bigot," Thomas said bluntly. "You were a product of your time," Samuel corrected. "But you chose to grow beyond it. That's what mattered." Thomas closed his eyes. "I wish I had more time. There's so much more to learn." "You taught me something too," Samuel said quietly. "What's that?" "That people can change. That even the most rigid prejudices can crack when confronted with undeniable truth. You gave me hope for what's possible." Thomas smiled. "Veritas vos liberabit, sed prima vos iratum fatiet." The truth will set you free, but first it will make you angry. Samuel translated. "You remembered. How could I forget? It was the beginning of everything." Thomas Whitmore died that night at peace with the man he had become. Samuel returned to Washington, but came back to Mississippi every year on the anniversary of that day on the veranda, the day a 12-year-old boy in bare feet spoke 5 languages and changed the course of a man's life. The Whitmore School continued operating until 1954, when integration finally came to Mississippi schools. By then it had educated 3 generations of students, black and white, who went on to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders. And they all learned the same lesson that Thomas Whitmore had learned on that summer day in 1892. That true intelligence knows no color, no class, no age. It only requires opportunity, determination, and the courage to prove what others say is impossible. Samuel Johnson's story proves that real power doesn't come from wealth or privilege, but from knowledge that no one can take away. If this journey of courage and justice has inspired you, remember that education is the one weapon no one can strip from you. Samuel used his mind to change not just his own life, but the life of a man who thought he knew everything about the world and in doing so, changed the future for hundreds of others.